I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on Spotlight, we're speaking with Samuel Jay Korson. He is an author who is delivering a deeply researched examination of Jewish individuals' experiences in the Confederate South during the American Civil War. His thought-provoking work opens up new perspectives on a well-known historical era, shedding light on the rarely told stories of Jewish individuals navigating their faith in the face of slavery, anti-Semitism, and a predominantly Christian society. The book is called The Jewish Confederate Story. We're delighted to have Sam join us here today on Spotlight. We thank the team at Atticus Publishing for helping us put him in the spotlight today. And we ask viewers like you to support writers like him by subscribing to our channel. Sam, thanks so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
Thank you for having me, Logan.
My pleasure. What sparked your interest in writing the Jewish Confederate story?
Well, I love American history.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the areas that I'm very deeply involved in is Civil War. And being Jewish, I obviously have a liking for Jewish history. And when I was getting my master's degree at Mary Washington College down in Fredericksburg, Virginia, one of the degree requirements was to either write a paper or do a special project.
Right.
I opted for the traditional paper. So discussed it with my advisors, and we finally agreed on the fact that I would do a paper on Jews in the Confederacy. Originally, I was going to do Jews in the Civil War, but they said that was pretty well covered, or if not covered, there's just too much stuff out there for a master's degree paper. So they said, let's narrow it down. And I said, well, okay, I live in the South. Why not Jews in the Confederacy? And that's the genesis of the book. So the book actually languished for about, no, actually it wasn't even a book, it was a paper, 73-page paper that languished in this house for about 22 years. And a friend of mine said, I think you ought to submit that to a Civil War magazine for an article. So I said, okay. So I made a couple mistakes, wound up sending it to Austin McCauley. They published it as a book. That's the Reader's Digest version. So it literally went from a 73-page paper to a potential article to a 64-page book. So it's not a very big book, not very long, but it pretty well summarizes, I think, very nicely, very succinctly, the Jewish version or the Jewish actions in the South during the Civil War.
Right. Now, was there a sizable Jewish community in the South during the Civil War?
In a couple places there were. I think New Orleans had about 25,000. Charleston, South Carolina, they had about 1/3 of that. So there really wasn't an overwhelming, huge Jewish population in the South. I would say, just pulling a couple numbers out, maybe 30 or 40,000. Most of them being in the big cities of New Orleans, Charleston. Mobile had a sizable Jewish community, and there were Jews scattered all over the place.
And were they faced with anti-Semitism?
Well, Logan, you can go back 2,000-3,000 years. Anti-Semitism has always been there.
Yeah.
So there was some, but sadly not near as much as there is today.
Wow.
I mean, most people back in mid-19th century America, they disagreed if you didn't go to a Baptist church every day or every week, and a Catholic church along with it. But if you were Jewish or if you were Muslim, you were pretty well left alone for the most part.
Yeah. Well, our nation was founded on religious freedom, so you would think people of different religious groups would be left alone, particularly in the early part of our history, 100 years or so into it. But it's not always the case, of course. What about the issue of slavery? The Jewish people, of course, were enslaved, and then dealing with an area that was propped up by slavery. Were there moral dilemmas for the Jewish citizens living in the South?
Well, it depended. There were some Jews in the South that just totally abhorred slavery.
Mm-hmm.
They came from countries where they were oppressed. They belonged to a religion that celebrates Passover every year, which was a freedom from slavery.
Yeah.
So they basically had a hands-off, not interested. There were others that basically wanted to assimilate. They looked at the South as their new homes. Slavery was certainly legal. The 13th and 14th Amendments had not been passed yet, hadn't even been thought of yet.
Mm-hmm.
So there were some that engaged in slavery. They were slave owners. They were traders. So sadly, very sadly, there were some that had no problems with assimilating to the part that they owned slaves, the same way that their Baptist, their Methodist, and their Catholic neighbors did.
Tell me about the experiences of Jews in the Confederate South versus those in the North. Was it a very different experience in your opinion and from your research?
To be honest, I didn't really dig that deep into the North, but what I do know up in the North, yeah, there was some anti-Semitism up there. There's always been anti-Semitism.
Right.
When things go bad, who do you blame? The Jews.
Yeah.
I mean, just several years ago in Washington, D.C., the weather, this is not a lie, the weather didn't do what it was supposed to do. And there was a council member in Washington, D.C. that said it was those damn Jews that changed the weather.
Crazy.
So
Unbelievable.
I got to be honest, Logan, I wish I had half as much power as some people think I have, as being somebody who's Jewish. But in the South, most of the Jews in the South, they were pretty well left alone. And I think up in the North, there was, like I said, there was some anti-Semitism, not as much as what occurred, when you went further south. But even that was a situation where when the war started to go bad for the South, basically it was, who do we blame?
Yeah. Amazing. It was funny before when you said, if I had half the power that the haters say I have, it's like, if you were half as powerful as Mel Gibson thinks you are, this book would be a movie by now.
Good point. Good point.
Exactly. What are you hoping folks take away from this book? And is it aimed mostly at a Jewish population as far as readers go?
Well, let me take the last question first.
Sure.
No, it is not. It's aimed at everybody. Everybody that's got an interest in the American Civil War, that's got, in particular, but American history in general. There's a lot of people that, and I did a speech for Human Rights Day several years ago. I was on the Human Rights Commission here in Prince William County. And I did a speech, and what I was trying to do is dispel the theory from a lot of people. Now, let's just leave it as a lot of people that feel as if, it's like African Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans, and Jews, those four in particular groups, just don't do anything. We just live here. We work, but we're the fault of everything that's really bad about the United States. We don't fight. We don't serve our country. So I did a speech about that, and you'd be surprised how many Medals of Honor, Navy Crosses, Distinguished Service Crosses, those four groups compiled in World Wars I and II alone. Right. And I stopped my speech at World War II. I didn't even go into Korea, Vietnam, or later wars. Yeah. So basically, what I'm hoping to get out of the book is that it's not even a Jewish perspective of the Civil War. It's basically a perspective that, hey, it wasn't just Baptists or Catholics that were fighting for the Confederacy. There were Jews that were doing it too. And I didn't get into whether, I don't even have any idea how many Muslims there were, running around at that stage. But basically, it was just my small attempt to show that Hey, the Jews certainly were very much involved. I mean, Judah P. Benjamin, he was the Secretary of State for the Confederacy. He was the Secretary of the Treasury, and he was the Secretary of War, and he was very Jewish.
Mm.
He didn't go around bragging about it or anything, but he was Jewish. And
Right.
so there was a guy that kept the Confederacy afloat for 4 years.
Mm. Interesting. Were the Jews of that era religious Jews? I mean, because today we think of Reform Jews, conservative Jews, Orthodox Jews. I don't know if there were those divisions back then. I don't know if when the whole Reform movement came in, that kind of stuff.
So the Reform Jews. So again, let's go backwards. I'll get the first question first this time.
Sure.
All the Jews that were in the United States at that time were essentially Orthodox.
Okay.
There was no Reform Judaism for probably about another, I would say probably 10, 15 years. Conservative Judaism probably followed that by about another 10, 15 years. And of course, we've had Orthodox, varying degrees of Orthodox forever.
Hmm.
So everybody was pretty well Orthodox. You went to a synagogue on Shabbat, on Sabbath, Saturdays. You made every effort to eat kosher.
Hmm.
You followed the holidays. You were certainly in the synagogue for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur in the fall. So, yeah, everybody was pretty well Orthodox.
Hmm.
And that was one of the interesting things that I found in the book, was that most of them really, really, really tried, unlike 21st century Jews, or many 21st century Jews, most of them in the antebellum and the Civil War South really did try to maintain their Orthodox Judaism.
Hmm.
And that was actually a very gratifying thing from my perspective to see.
Well, it took some courage, I would think, in that era to, cover your head and to go to shul or temple in a society where, most of the people around you do not.
Well, and again, before the Civil War, most of them were pretty well left alone. Oh,
Hmm.
you're Jewish? That's nice. So I guess you're not going to be going to the party on Saturday.
Right.
There was a young lady in New Orleans. Her name was Clara Solomon, and I've got her book on her diary on my bookshelf here. She writes in there that her family was very Orthodox. They went to shul every Saturday. But here was the other thing that really struck me, was that down in New Orleans, back in those days, you went to school 6 days a week.
Hmm.
So you went Monday through Saturday. Well, Clara was never in school on Saturday because it was Sabbath.
Hmm.
Now, interestingly, she noted in there that her friends never yanked her chain about it, never said anything nasty about it. They respected her religious beliefs, that she was not out running around having a good time on Saturday. She was sitting in probably about a 3-hour service in an air-conditioned
Right.
synagogue in New Orleans.
Amazing. Amazing. It's an interesting chapter of our history. It's very, very disheartening to hear you say you think things are worse today for Jewish people in the United States. We can only hope and hopefully only pray that changes. Where do you think most of those manifestations? I mean, I don't see. I'm not Jewish, but I don't see it. You know what I mean? And sometimes it's like being black. You have to be black to feel it.
Mm-hmm.
Where do you think most of the manifestations of anti-Semitism are today? In like these different right-wing hate groups?
Yeah, I think you hit that nail right on the head.
Okay.
The white supremacists, groups like that, who just feel as if the only ones who deserve to be in the United States are, if I may say it, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants.
Right.
I mean, they don't like Catholics. They don't like blacks. They
Right.
don't like Jews.
I was
They
just
don't
going to say
like
they hate
Muslims.
everybody. They're
They hate
equal
everybody.
opportunity offenders.
Yeah, unless you happen to be a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant. And
Right.
that covers a lot of territory. I mean, that's Methodist, that's Episcopalians. That's a lot.
Right. Exactly. Well, really interesting talk. Sam, thanks so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
It was my pleasure. Glad I was able to spread the word a little bit.
Absolutely. And let me help spread the word as well. The name of the book is The Jewish Confederate Story. It is written by Samuel Jay Korson. It's a fascinating look at a chapter in history that I think to some is unknown. I don't think too many people know the Jewish American experience in the South during the Civil War and the Confederacy. So it is highly recommended for anyone who is interested in American history, and that should be just about everyone. Sam, thanks again for being our guest.
All right. Thank you, Logan.
My pleasure. And to the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time. Until next time on Spotlight.